Is meter the same thing as rhythm? No. Okay, cool. If you clicked on this video for a simple answer, you can leave now. Still with me? Great, because it's actually a lot more complicated. It's a question that trips up lots of new musicians, but also, while most experts agree there is a difference, they're not entirely clear on what exactly that difference is. Ask 10 music theorists and you'll probably get about 15 subtly different answers, including that one guy who says they're not different at all, but one thing they'll probably all agree on is that they're both really important if you want to understand groove. So let's do that. Let's try to figure out how these two concepts are related and what, if anything, sets them apart. Before we get started, if you want to see my next video a month early, or just watch this one ad-free, those are both live now on Patreon. There's a link in the description, more on that at the end of the video. So I asked this question on Blue Sky, and I got a lot of great responses, but the general consensus was that rhythm is the specific timing and duration of the actual played notes, while meter is the containers of time that those rhythms happen inside of. To paraphrase one of my favorite answers, rhythm is what you feel, meter is what you count. And that's a pretty good starting place, especially because most Western-trained musicians learn to think of meter as basically a synonym for time signature. Now, I assume most people watching this know how to read a time signature, but for those of you who don't, they consist of two numbers. The top one says how many beats are in a bar, and the bottom one says what counts as a beat. So a bar of 4/4 has 4 quarter notes, a bar of 6/8 has 6/8 notes, 5/16 has 5/16, and so on. And that leads us to another question that I think will be a really useful springboard for this discussion. What's the difference between 3/4 and 6/8? This confuses a lot of new musicians. I know it confused me when I was younger. You've got twice as many beats, but they're half as long, so it's the same thing, right? But of course it's not, because time signatures are about more than just relative length. In fact, they used to convey a lot more. These days we're used to seeing tempo markings that show exactly how fast a song should be played, but that's actually relatively new. Go back a couple centuries, at least in Europe, and you find yourself in a musical world run by a system called tempo giusto, or correct time. Composers in the 1600s rarely gave any direct indication of their preferred tempo. Instead, they left it to the performer to work out based on context clues, including the style of the piece, the rhythms involved, and, of course, the time signature. That's why Bach's Prelude in C sharp is written in 3/8. If it was 3/4, you'd have to play it a lot slower. Okay, stop that. Over the years, as metronome technologies advanced and notation practices became more precise, time signatures became divorced from the tempo, although both are still an important part of what we consider meter. More on that later. But that doesn't really answer our question. Tempo giusto for 3/4 and 6/8 would probably be pretty similar, even if that still mattered. No, the real difference is with the other piece of information a time signature conveys. You see, musicians use the word rhythm weirdly. As Dr. Christopher Hasty points out, most of the time when we say something is rhythmic, we mean it has periodicity, or a consistent repeating pattern. A heartbeat is rhythmic. A ticking clock is rhythmic. The orbit of planets has its own slow, cosmic rhythm. But musical rhythm isn't like that. Musical rhythm is just about what we call inter-onset intervals, or the amount of time between events. Musical rhythm is chaotic, shapeless, a series of note values that tell you how long each thing lasts, but have nothing to say about any sort of larger structure. This is a perfectly valid set of rhythms, even if I have no idea how to groove to it. And that's fine, music doesn't need structure, but often musicians want structure. Meter is one way of imposing that structure on those otherwise uncontrolled rhythms, and the way it does that is through patterns of emphasis. There's lots of different ways to create emphasis in music, but we can break them up into two broad categories: structural accents and phenomenal accents. Phenomenal accents are created by specific events within the performance. Like, a dynamic accent is when a particular note is louder or more pronounced. You know, bang on a drum, smash a chord, or really punch your vocal delivery. That sort of thing. Agogic accents are based on duration. If you hold a note for a long time, it naturally takes on a sort of emphasis. There's also melodic accents from large leaps, harmonic accents from chord changes, lyrical accents from the poetic flow of syllables, and a whole lot more. Seriously, I could do a whole video on these, and probably will at some point. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that. But for now, what matters is that because they're things that actually happen, phenomenal accents belong to the domain of rhythm. If we want meter, then the accents we're looking for are structural. These are more abstract than the phenomenal ones, less about specific events and more about patterns. That's important because your brain isn't very good at paying complete focused attention all the time. Even if you're just trying to listen, you'll still drift in and out, and repeated patterns of emphasis give you cues on when you need to lock in through a process called entrainment. You can see this at a large scale in song form. If you're at a karaoke bar, you might chat with your friend during the verses, then turn to sing along for the chorus. At a more moment-to-moment level, though, rhythmic entrainment is a key part of how music manages your attention to keep you engaged without exhausting you, and meter is the vocabulary we use to describe it. But before we go further, I do need to add an important caveat. While some of this patterning is a result of natural cognitive processes, it's also shaped through enculturation. You subconsciously learn the typical patterns of your culture's music by listening to it, then use that knowledge to inform your approach to new songs. I'm not going to spend much time breaking down which aspects of meter are innate brain functions and which are learned cultural practices, because it's really hard to disentangle those two, and often the best answer is that it's actually a little bit of both. Just know that the concept of meter I'm going to describe is based on a combination of European classical music and modern Western pop, and may not translate very well to other traditions. In fact, while every musical culture I'm aware of has some concept of rhythm, not all of them even use anything we'd recognize as meter. It's always important to remember that music theory exists within cultural contexts, and nothing, not even the most basic math stuff, is universal. Anyway, structural accents are basically the accents we impose on the music, the ones we expect to be there even without hearing them. Like, if I play a series of identical pulses, your brain probably did a couple things to try to make sense of it. For starters, you probably assumed the first note was the downbeat. Why wouldn't it be? This is called primacy bias, where the first thing you hear is accented just by virtue of being first. You also probably started grouping them into strong and weak attacks, most likely in groups of 2 and 4. Western music, especially pop music, loves groups of 2 and 4, so experienced pop listeners will naturally gravitate toward that structure unless something they hear contradicts it. And of course, there's the assumption of continuity. Once you start hearing a particular pattern, you'll need some direct evidence of change before you're willing to hear a different one. That's how patterns work. All this means that despite containing no phenomenal accents whatsoever, I can still reasonably guess that most of you probably heard the clip I played as if it was 2 bars of eighth notes in 4/4. Of course, it wouldn't be hard for me to change that perception with a little guidance, using subtle dynamic accents to point your ear toward a different pulse, but either way, those initial patterns are the foundation of what we mean when we say meter. Which brings me to the traditional model of meter. I actually have a slight issue with this approach, which I'll get to in a bit, but overall I do like it. In this view, meter is a conversation between 3 layers of evenly spaced pulses moving at different speeds. In the middle, we have the beat, which music theorists call the tactus because it's fun to have fancy words for things. Typically, the beat layer will be somewhere in the range of like 70 to 120 beats per minute. Our brains aren't great at accurately tracking pulses that are too fast or too slow, so a comfortable, moderately paced beat leaves plenty of room for the other layers. That said, this isn't a hard rule or anything, it's just another default assumption. Below that, we have the subdivision layer. This comes in 2 flavors. Simple meter, where the pulse cuts the beat in half, and compound meter, where it divides it in thirds. And above we have the bar layer. This one has 3 shapes. In duple meter, a bar is 2 beats, in triple meter it's 3 beats, and in quadruple meter it's 4. Combining the subdivisions with the bar lengths gives us 6 basic meters, and it also answers our question from before. By convention, the time signatures for simple meter use a quarter note pulse, while compound meter uses eighth notes that align with the subdivisions. So 3/4 is simple triple meter, while 6/8 is compound duple meter, which is a really complicated way of saying 3/4 sounds like this, and 6/8 sounds like this. Same length, but the accent pattern is different. These are the only 2 basic meters that have that relationship, and lots of composers have played around with it, most famously in America from West Side Story.
Life is all right in America. If you're all white in America.
Flipping back and forth feels natural because the bar length is the same, but you get this compelling disorientation as your metric expectations keep changing. And I like this framework because it highlights the fractal nature of meter. It doesn't privilege any particular layer. A bar is divided into beats, which are divided into subdivisions, or looking at it another way, subdivisions are grouped into beats, which are grouped into bars. This bridges the gap between the 2 major philosophies of meter. Divisive meter, the version you're probably more familiar with works by taking a large unit of time, typically a bar, and chopping it up evenly into smaller pieces. Additive meter, on the other hand, starts with a small value, like a subdivision, and combines them in different lengths to create larger, more complex rhythms. But once we switch to thinking in pulse layers, we see that both of them are acting on the same elements, just from different directions. And we can take this further. Bars can be grouped into phrases, which are grouped into sections, which are grouped into songs, while eighth note subdivisions can be divided into 16th notes, 32nds, triplets, and so on. At every level, no matter how much we zoom in or out, the structure is the same. Kind of. Except not really. Again, we're not great at tracking pulses that move too fast or too slow, and as we keep grouping and subdividing, we eventually start crossing those thresholds. So while the structures look the same on paper, as we move further and further from that central beat layer, they start to take on new perceptual characters. Like, if we zoom in far enough, we find ourselves in the realm of microrhythm, where the pulses are so close that they blur together. We can make small adjustments here to change the vibe without affecting the apparent rhythms. That's the difference between this groove and this one. You could probably feel some sort of change, but we're so far away from anything slow enough to be metric that it doesn't really make sense to try to measure that change precisely, at least not without the help of a computer. Like, you may have noticed that the offbeat kicks were a little late, but could you have told me that the second one is twice as late as the first? And honestly, you might not have even noticed the delay at all, at least not consciously. Most people don't. It may have just sounded a little more laid back in some indescribable way. Microrhythms aren't meant to be picked apart because the exact ratio doesn't matter, and when it comes to human performances, they're not that consistent anyway. But while the details are largely meaningless, the overall effect can still be really powerful. After all, without microrhythms, we couldn't have swing. This is in 4/4, but somewhere, deep down in the pulse layers, something's getting divided strangely. On the other hand, zooming out eventually drags the pulses so far apart that we can't really track their connections anymore, and right on the edge of that space is where we get hypermeter. Hypermeter is to bars what meter is to beats. It's how we know how long a phrase should be. And because we're already pushing the bounds of what we can reasonably keep track of, hypermeter tends to be much more consistent across songs. In pop and rock, phrases are either 2, 4, or occasionally 8 bars, and hearing anything else is pretty surprising. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but songs that do it are typically trying to throw you off. Like, take the 3-bar phrase. I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time hearing this naturally. It always either sounds like a 4-bar phrase getting cut off, or a 2-bar phrase with an unstable tag. There's a sort of discomfort that's hard to put my finger on, but also hard to ignore, as this pulse layer that's just barely too slow to count gets violated. And I say violated because in most cases, including both the songs I just played, these 3-bar phrases aren't the norm. In other sections, the phrases are a more typical 4 bars long. These are exceptions, specifically abusing hypermetric dissonance to destabilize your sense of time. And we can keep zooming out. Sections are typically 2 or 4 phrases long after all, but at a certain point, this becomes dangerous. If you're counting, say, the distribution of sections in a song, your pulses start to be like 20 to 30 seconds apart, and your brain can't maintain a count at 2 beats per minute. It's too slow. For that reason, some theorists have warned against reading too deeply into the apparently rhythmic structure of hypermeter, and the analogy does eventually wear thin. It's difficult to imagine, for instance, what hypermetric syncopation would be. Maybe this? You live for the fight when that's all that you got. But that missing beat never gets replaced, and it'd feel even weirder if it was, so maybe not. I'll be honest, I just wanted to play Livin' on a Prayer. But I said I had an issue with this framework, and I do. This is where things get spicy. Multiple textbooks I read for this went out of their way to emphasize that in order for something to be meter, the pulses have to be evenly spaced. One even went so far as to say that meter depends on regularity for its definition. And that's true. To a point. If the pattern doesn't repeat, it's not a pattern. But to see the problem here, we don't even have to leave the domain of pop music, although it might help to consider pop music written in Spanish. Now, I can notate that pretty easily in 4/4. I can even count it like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But what structure in the music does that count represent? I'd argue nothing, or at least nothing particularly important. The vocal accents are ambiguous, but the percussion is dominated by that snare, playing a really important rhythm in Latin pop called a tresillo. This splits 8 pulses of the subdivision into 3 uneven beats, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that, to my mind, is a much better description of what's happening here. If meter is about providing a structure for rhythmic entrainment, then the tresillo, not the even 4-bar count, is what I entrain to. Despite supposedly being a beat, it takes active effort for me to point my attention at the moment after the second snare. And while meter is also an important part of performance practice, I feel like it's safe to say the musicians are also hearing it that way, since even as the orchestration changes throughout the song, that tresillo pulse remains consistent. And you could argue that this is just syncopation, that the metric structure of the 4/4 pulse is still there, they're just using a phenomenal accent to highlight an offbeat for rhythmic interest. And to that I'd say, yeah, that's also a valid interpretation. In fact, it's one that a lot of music theorists seem to prefer. I'd even agree with it in some cases. This has a similar tresillo pattern in the snare, but on this one I do hear even pulses, probably because of the more prominent kick. But as an unbreakable law of meter, I just can't really endorse it, because it feels unmusical. It's starting from an assumption about how the song is supposed to behave, then working backwards to explain why it doesn't. Again, let's go back to that example with the identical pulses. With no guidance, your brain filled in a set of assumptions about the meter based on past experiences and cognitive biases. But once we added new information, new patterns of emphasis, it not only changed your surface level rhythmic perception, it reshaped your understanding of the underlying meter. This, to me, seems like a logical extension of that. I'm always going to look for even pulses, but when I don't find them, what am I supposed to do? Should I mentally insert them anyway, or follow the path of the music I hear? If you said mentally insert them anyway, cool. Again, totally reasonable answer, but I'd ask you to consider if that's how you actually feel it, or if you're being hoodwinked by the tyrannical familiarity of 4/4. Because while the tresillo question is an important one, it's actually not the easiest place to see the need for uneven pulses. Consider 5/4. There are songs that make sense to count with 5 even beats, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it's more common to play it with a sort of ebb and flow feel, alternating 2 long beats and 2 shorter ones, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, we can hear a similar thing in that America example from earlier. I said it was constantly changing between 6/8 and 3/4, but that's not really how I hear it. Instead, I hear it as one longer bar with 5 uneven beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The pattern of accents is consistent and periodic, so I have no trouble in training to it. It's just not even. This sort of pattern with multiple kinds of beats of different lengths is what we typically mean when we say additive meter. It's just, in the context of pulse layers, I'm not sure how meaningful that difference really is. But in all those examples, an even pulse is still possible. What if it wasn't? What about 7/8? Remember, an 8 in the time signature says it's counting the subdivisions, so we still need a beat layer on top. But 7 is prime. There's no set of even pulses that cleanly bridges the gap between the bar layer and the subdivision layer. Anything in 7 is going to be jagged. Sometimes it reads like 4/4 with the end cut off, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes it's 3/4 with an extended final beat, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And sometimes it's something weirder, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, this can get even trickier. After all, 7/8 is the 4/4 of odd meter. But off the top of your head, how would you count in 1916? I don't know. Maybe like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or maybe something completely different. In Western music, there is no agreed upon pattern for that time signature, and that makes it really hard to entrain to. You have no intuition for how it's supposed to feel, so the meter becomes wonky and incoherent. That said, this is definitely one of those places where enculturation plays a big role. Other musical traditions, like Indian classical and Bulkin folk, are much more likely to use these sorts of uneven pulses, so listeners familiar with those styles will have an easier time picking up the groove. But if we really want to get at the difference between rhythm and meter, it might be best to look at what happens when we start stacking them. That is, what's the difference between polyrhythm and polymeter? In both cases, we have two overlapping patterns of accents, but if we don't want them to feel completely unrelated, they have to agree on something. And that brings us back to our pulse layers. In polyrhythm, the two patterns use the same pulse rate for the bar layer, but divide it differently into beats and subdivisions. Here's a 4/5 polyrhythm. In polymeter, on the other hand, they agree on the beat layer, or sometimes the subdivisions if the beat is uneven, and vary the length of the bar instead. Here's a 4/5 polymeter. Like before then, the difference is mostly one of timescale. Rhythms are moment-to-moment events, while meters unfold slowly, methodically, and above all, periodically. That said, in both cases, plenty of research has shown that you're not actually capable of holding both pulses in your head simultaneously. You'll naturally hear one as the real beat and the other as a complex set of syncopations. Polyrhythms are useful as a concept, but at a perceptual level, they're not actually real. So what's the takeaway here? We started by asking if meter is the same thing as rhythm, and while I said no at the beginning, I honestly think the answer is kinda. Meter is a product of rhythm, and rhythm is, or at least can be, an expression of meter. They exist at different timescales and are used for different purposes, but they're so interrelated that, to my mind, they're more like two sides of the same coin. I think there's a tendency to overcomplicate meter, to divorce it from its rhythmic origins, and that can be useful. Again, it's easy to take the analogy too far, but it can also make meter feel distant, alien, something we impose on the music rather than a natural component of it. It's tempting to think of the difference between meter and rhythm as the difference between the map and the road, but I think it's closer to the difference between the road and the drive. If that makes sense. I think it does. I'm gonna say it makes sense. I've been thinking a lot lately about Ozzy Osbourne. I've been a metalhead since I was old enough to decide my own musical taste, and every band I grew up listening to owed some sort of debt to Sabbath. Ozzy was the godfather of my entire musical childhood, and his passing hit me hard. I think it hit a lot of people hard. So I wanted to pay tribute the only way I know how, by analyzing one of my favorite songs of his, Crazy Train. That video is up now on Patreon. My patrons get to vote on what songs I talk about, and they overwhelmingly agreed to pay tribute to the Prince of Darkness, so to say thanks for all their support, I put the video there first. It'll go up on YouTube in about a month or so, but if you can't wait, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. And as always, thanks for watching. Thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Howard Levine, Warren Hewitt, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, Neil Moore, and Jeff. Check out Patreon for a fuller outro, and as always, keep on rockin'.